Hi, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Decarb Connect podcast. And this week, I'm joined by Ben Moens, who's Managing Director of Sustainability Solutions for Engie Impact. And we're going to be having a look at something a little bit different. So rather than our usual focus on a particular technology or a particular tool that could affect decarbonisation, we're going to be looking at other kinds of predictors of future success in decarbonisation. And Ben's sense of some of those essential shifts that we need to deliver net zero. So Ben, why don't we start with you giving a little bit of a kind of an intro to who you are and how you've arrived at this point in time and the work that you're doing.
Sure. Hi, Alex. Thanks for having me. So my road into decarbonization actually started back when I was a consultant, at some of the big names, the well-known houses. So I've been working actually the past 70 years almost on big questions of business transformation in companies, and that's with a very different trigger to the transformation. It could be the execution of a strategy, it could be a merger and acquisition, could actually be performance improvement. But the constant was that it was always, a global challenge of transforming a corporate really to its deepest roots. So really looking at all sorts of impact you could have on processes, organization, governance, and you name it. And it's actually in that role that I increasingly started to work more and more on energy transition related topics. So primarily, first of all, in the power sector, but then expanding towards more industrial sectors. And, with the creation of Engie Impact back in 2019, I really saw an opportunity that I could make both ends meet and actually make it my full-time focus to apply energy transition challenges really on a transformational scale. And I think, it's pretty clear that if you look at the type of transformations that companies have lived through, that this wave of sustainability and emission reduction is probably the biggest transformation they'll ever go through, both in terms of impact it has, in terms of scale, as the duration these companies will have to sustain these efforts. And that I think, looking at personally at my career and where I stood, was an excellent opportunity to join that race and that journey.
Let's start with a sort of bigger picture question. So when you're looking across the hard to abate sectors, which, as you know, is kind of Decarb Connect's lens, is really the manufacturers of those hardest to abate products like cement or steel. When you look across those sectors, what are some of the behaviours and the habits that either you think is, getting in the way, or that's already actually, this company's got it and they're moving successfully to remove barriers to decarbonisation? What are those behaviours and habits, either way, that you think are worth noting?
Obviously a big question. I think first you should probably pin it down on maybe defining what is success, because obviously we're talking about very long horizons to 2050 and beyond. But when I think about success in these sectors, I'd rather pin it down for now on 2030 and see, in that time frame, despite the many constraints that these sectors are facing on still technology side and financial and the like, I would like to focus on some behaviors where I see that, despite these constraints, companies accelerate things, move forward more quickly, and are especially building the foundations to then really accelerate after 2030. I think it's often said it's a decade to deliver, it's a climate decade, but I feel that's especially true for these hard to abate sectors that are, having this immense challenge of finding solutions they will be able to scale, while at the same time, I think safeguarding their overall business. And so when I look at especially this coming decade, where I see that some companies are doing things that are, for me, predictors to success, it basically boils down to three key things. I think first of all, when you just take it from indeed the technology standpoint and the question of what are some of the most promising levers for these companies to address, for me, the winners are the ones that have a very good understanding of actually how these levers come together, and actually companies that have then an ability to define an integrated strategy against that. I think that I would say is predictor number one. The second key thing then is the way actually companies take investment decisions around that. And what we often observe is that if you take typical investment policies, they're very much driven by return on investment and payback. And there I see that companies that actually are effective in defining that decarbonization strategy are also taking more lens of total cost of ownership and think much more in terms of long-term scenarios related to that. And then I think a third large predictor of success is probably the way that companies collaborate within the value chain. And that's related to how they build the right effective coalitions to get things done already in this decade, or again to start building these foundations, but also the way they actually source capabilities and resources to really upscale that transition to what is needed to be on track for a net zero scenario. So.
And if you think about those three as like your kind of this three-way tick box, this is another kind of big question, but what proportion of companies that you come across do you think kind of are starting to use these right kind of behaviors? Is it a minority, or is it perhaps more than we think? What was your imprecise best assumption be of how many of these best behaviors we're really seeing in action?
Yeah. Well, for sure, I haven't done the full check, but I think based on my observations, I would say it's rather a minority. It's probably 3 companies out of 10 that are really found a way to connect the dots in the right way. And just like starting, for instance, with the question of how to address different emission reduction levers. No, I think a lot of companies actually were already on a certain journey to have a first achievements with the energy efficiency programs, green electricity sourcing. Obviously, PPA markets took off. So on-site renewables. So that did initial investments, have initial success. But what I see that actually a lot of these companies have approached that really as individual technology programs, if you want. They're really been mobilizing this against the remit of that individual technology. They did it because it was technically feasible and because it had a certain return. It was driving certain even cost savings. And in a way, it was not a hard decision to take. What I see at a lot of these companies, despite their initial success, there's that big risk that they'll soon be hitting a wall, because now they get into the much harder questions of emission reduction. They have to tackle the green thermal question. They might be exploring other less mature technologies, where it's related to hydrogen, to carbon capture, etc. I see that suddenly they realize that the approach they were taking in the past will not bring them much further, and they need to find novel ways to actually get the company to commit on some of these new programs, embrace some of the higher risks associated with it, the less clear financials, and very often as well, the lack of my mature capabilities in the market to deliver that. And that's where I think that's companies that from the start have been investing more in creating a view on that long-term journey, or really that end state target that they need to realize, and actually reflect not how individual technologies get them there, but truly find ways to combine them in an integrated strategy. I think these companies will do 2 things different. First of all, they might launch pilots much more sooner to get individual sites further in their journey. And I think the learnings that you have from that will be so critical in understanding what it will take to upscale that within their footprint. That's one thing. And secondly, what they also will do better is to find the synergies between these technologies, between individual technologies. And that's something that should not be underestimated. If you actually look today, take for instance the green thermal question. Obviously, you see a lot of companies looking at the question of electrification. There's a possibility to also look at the use of CCUS combined with combustion technologies. There's even on the green thermal itself, you have multiple new commodities you could consider: hydrogen, synthetic fuels, biofuels, you name it. So there are in a way a lot of dependencies and possibilities in between these technologies to create actually a holistic system that is actually optimized. We see, for instance, that if we tackle green thermal questions, very often the solution is a mix of, for instance, a heat recovery system, from an energy efficiency standpoint, and this industrial heat pump to realize the temperature lift. You could add an e-boiler to basically serve peaking loads, with an electrification scheme, and then still maybe in combination with the base load combustion technology, for instance, on biomethane. But what we start to see is that these future, zero carbon on-site systems will be in a large extent hybrid systems. It will not just be a single technology. No, it will always be a combination of those, and in a way that you really can capture synergies between them. I think for that to do well, I think these companies need to, embrace that question much more from a dynamic system perspective. They really need to understand, what in the future in my production scheme will be base versus peak loads. They need to size against that. They need to find, they need to see how, for instance, a baseload technology like a biomethane CHP, could be combined with, for instance, an electric boiler to make use of the for instance, the favorable economics you have in the electricity markets at times, or even the availability of on-site renewable electricity they could tap into, at very low cost. So that type of system thinking and the ability to really strategize against that will become very significant for these companies to get right. And that's not easy, because that requires really truly a blend of strategy skills, of long-term planning, and of really like deep engineering in a way.
I'm interested in, like, to what extent do you think that the urge or the kind of impulse to focus on technology is almost, do you see that as it sometimes being part of the issue? Because in some sectors that are starting to see kind of real changes in the opportunity to decarbonize, it's not by tech first, it's by sort of almost reimagining how the core business may even work. And that's obviously significantly harder in these old traditional industries. But do you have a view on that, or do you think actually no, it's right, they just need to focus on the technological application to an existing process that can get them to net zero? What's your view on that?
Well, I always say that companies of that sort ideally have some sort of a dual strategy. I think, on the one hand, like you say, they need to think about that fundamental R&D, and that will introduce new process technologies. And I see a lot of that, e-crackers, electrolyzers of steel. I mean, the lot of long-term bets that these companies are anyway making, and that will lead to a very fundamental shift in how they produce things. But I think that can never be an excuse not to make progress in the interim. And that's where, as well, with that more holistic integrated system thinking on decarbonization levers, I think there are today a lot of opportunities to get to, what I call smart transition schemes. It's basically, strategies where you can more gradually start to shift your production towards a low carbon form of manufacturing. And let me give you one example to make it tangible. For instance, in the steel sector, we probably all know that that direct reduced iron, so DRI, is part of the future solution set. Where basically hydrogen will be used to do used as a reduction agent. Now, actually, when you think about it, there's perhaps a smarter way to think about DRI. DRI works perfectly on the basis of natural gas. I mean, that's a process they have known for decades. So in that sense, you can apply it on existing sites. And our thinking is, like, instead of feeding that with the DRI process with hydrogen, you feed it with synthetic methane. But then what you do is actually the synthetic methane, where does it come from? You actually create some sort of a carbon looping on the site, where you capture the carbon coming from, the DRI process on natural gas. And you capture it and you blend it with, indeed, green hydrogen that you produce on the base of renewables. And then you basically buffer that synthetic methane. You can store it on site. And so you create a system where, it's almost fully dispatchable. You can decide when you want to use your synthetic green methane in your production process. And so what's the big benefit of that is that you, first of all, there's no need to have like a big bang switchover of assets. You don't need to change even your existing production methods. You can just rely on your existing DRI process. And it also allows you, if you have certain customers that really want to move forward, that have a willingness to pay, for instance, for a premium product, you can start to make literally green steel batches specific on request. And that's just one solution of where you can pin down, on the basis of an existing well-known carrier being methane. You can actually create already perfectly a low carbon ecosystem around it, more dispatchable, more flexible. And it might be, okay, in that sense, a little bit more expensive than the end state solution you want to go through, but at least it allows that you basically make that transition much easier and smoother, and you don't need to go all in from the very start. And I think, when you would consider other sectors, I think you can get to similar type of setups and conclusions. And I think that idea of creating a smoother transition is something that should be an important design criterion when you start to reflect on your future low carbon processes.
Okay, so that's kind of building out on that first point you made, which was about how do you develop an ability as an organization to sort of look at this whole issue of decarbonisation in an integrated way rather than mini project, which we all hear a lot about at the moment. The second point you made is also an interesting one to me, which is this movement towards total cost of ownership. Now, I wonder, could you sort of tell us a bit more about that? What does that mean? And can you give an example, just again, to bring it to life a little? What are you envisaging when you say that?
Sure. So for us, when you then start to reflect more on, what does it take a company to get to that end state ambition? You're immediately thinking in longer term scenarios. It's a sequence of adoption of new technologies that eventually will get you to your emission reduction target. And once you start mapping that scenario, what we do is we will look at the all related, obviously capex in new equipment. We look at the opex of that new equipment. We also look at the opex of the potential new commodities you need to source. It could be that you basically sourcing green hydrogen, that you're sourcing biomethane, you have your PPAs in place, etc. So we bring that all together to show what is the total cost of ownership of a given scenario. And then obviously the different scenarios, that could be, for instance, competing technology options you have. You might think of, for instance, a biomethane-based pathway versus maybe a biomass one versus an electrification scenario, which have distinctly different financial behaviors. But what we do is that we express that what's really that total cost of ownership over that total horizon to get to your end state. And when we do that, there's two important reflections we make. First of all, we'll contrast that with what we call the business as usual scenario. It's basically showing, how in your current state will certain costs inflate. And there's obviously commodity prices that we already see, that are on the rise. There's the impact of allowances, CO2 prices, carbon taxes, and the like. And there's not to forget also stranded asset risks, which can also lead to huge write-offs and costs. And often many of these things are not well captured when you look at a normal return on investment calculation. And the fact that we put a total cost of ownership on that business as usual scenario, that shows you like what is my true incremental cost of my least cost decarbonization pathway. And in our experience, when we are advising some of these corporates, we actually see that in many cases, the total cost of ownership of your best low carbon scenario is lower than the business as usual. And so the whole notion of investment decision making then takes a whole different spin. It's much easier to basically align different stakeholders around these scenarios to get that commitment, to really understand how, as an integrated solution that's providing the right economics. And it's in a way also very revealing, because what we typically see is that the capex portion and the total cost of ownership is very often less than 10%. And what is truly driving that total cost of ownership, it's still your future sourcing of commodities, whether it's renewable electricity, again, biomethane, hydrogen, and the like. That's what's really driving your total cost of ownership. And so it's funny that actually, when you think about emission reduction, that most companies look at it as a technology investment question. Well, in the end, it's definitely that, but it's much more, and even more importantly, also a future sourcing question that you need to get right. And that changes the whole perspective as well on the risks of these scenarios. Because if you consider, for instance, an electrification scenario where at the same time you can lock in your electricity price for 15 years or 20 years with a PPA. So obviously has much lower risk than if you have a competing scenario where you want to use a biomethane CHP on your site, for which the sourcing dynamics of biomethane are today very unclear yet. So that understanding of risk in these scenarios is really facilitated by that total cost of ownership thinking, and it gives you a better sense of what trade-offs you can make, not just on the base of cost, but also on the base of risk.
Yeah, I think one of the kind of interesting things in the background of that, though, as well, isn't it, is how do companies, particularly those of massive cross-border international scale, how do they get the right heads in the room on a regular enough basis to really assess these things? You need those different views, the finance specialists, the energy procurement specialists, as well as partners and everyone else in the room as well. But I wonder how many industrials are really doing that yet. The whole conversational tone shifts when they're involved.
No, it's critical. It goes together with what I said on the integrated strategies, and it's absolutely, as you say, actually the organization is a key reason why a lot of the programs in the past were run as isolated initiatives, and were not looked at holistically. And what we believe is that once you make that shift towards more an integrated perspective, and indeed you assemble that cross-functional team, you will first of all align these people on a better joint understanding of the possibilities of technologies, how they stack up, how far they bring you on your emission reduction journey. But then more critically is you'll start to see where you run into the barriers of adoption. And like I said today, for instance, on the finance function, you have actually investment policies that are not set up to support an emission reduction journey. These policies are still from a standpoint where a plant needs to compete on plant level. Investments in green technologies compete with any other sort of production related investments, and for sure payback often is of that nature that it doesn't make the cut. So you really have to lift it out of a lot of established practices and processes, and indeed organize it much more from a cross-functional program perspective, and challenge really a lot of the established thinking in the process, whether it's related to the way you commit investments, the way you do procurement, even the way that operations looks at business continuity and looks at quality and risk in all areas, and there's no exception. Practices will have to be in a way be revised, and I think establishing a cross-functional team, going quickly for a pilot site where you create that integrated perspective, again, is critical to establish the learnings to then scale up the program accordingly. And it's it's also making sure that you combine local stakeholders with central stakeholders more on corporate level, that you also look at this program not just as something that should be right for your first site, but where you also again create foundations to drive significant program synergies. What we for instance see is that again, thinking about the overall transition these companies need to go through, and the related project life cycle of doing engineering design, working with OEMs to source these technologies, doing the implementation. In each of these steps, there's a lot of opportunities to drive synergies across sites with economies of scale, with learnings that you basically transfer from one side to the other. And that's also something I would like to say is like companies need to focus a lot more on where the synergies to realize in that overall transition, rather than necessarily getting to the cheapest solution for a single site. And could even be of that nature that it really drives your technology choices, and that you maybe pass on an opportunity locally to do, for instance, shallow geothermal, but that you decide that you're just going to stick to a bit of a solution template that you established on the base of a pilot site, and that revealed that that technology is working, is viable, fits in the operations, and is ready to be scaled up in a modular way across your footprint.
You've articulated really clearly some of the other shifts in behaviour that's needed, but how is this going to affect collaboration and partnerships?
I think coming back to the point of your total costs and the risk perspective, for sure it helps to be open to coalition building. I think companies need to explore where in the value are there opportunities to collaborate, so that you can either pool volumes, you can pool risks related to these new technologies and the like, so that in the end you're like lowering that threshold to start innovating and adopt new technologies. And there's sure also opportunities to share infrastructure, to mutualize costs. There's also looking at alternative schemes where maybe instead of, for instance, looking at on-site green hydrogen electrolyzers, you work with other partners to rather look at setting up an import supply chain of green hydrogen. So I think it's critical that companies really go out and find proper partners that can mean something very tangible to the business case, or to indeed again reducing the risk of the transition. And that also means going downstream, working more with your customers. I think today there's not enough happening. Okay, there's a lot going on behind the doors, but I feel that companies still starting to get a grip on their own agenda on emission reduction, and do not feel ready yet to engage with their customers. But I think there's a very important key there to be able to move faster, and not just from a standpoint of finding a green premium, because maybe that potential is low, but it's just establishing the confidence that your clients are willing you to move, and that you can put a time frame to that you can put a joint ambition against that. Trusts can start to build to perhaps down the road make joint investments where needed. And I think you've seen some examples, automotive looking at green steel, but it's all still pretty limited today, I would say. I don't think especially the heavy industry sector probably can do more in terms of building these coalitions. The second key thing around building collaborations and partnerships is also reflecting on how eventually you will be able to mobilize resources at sufficiently large scale to achieve the transition on time. And that's not just financial resources. Obviously, the funding needs will be immense for these companies to realize their full transition. But it's not just about the money. I think it's also about where will you find the capabilities, and where will you find the partners that again can de-risk that journey for you. And in that sense, I think there's a very important future for players that basically will facilitate that transition on behalf of customers with things like utilities as a service, where in essence, you say to a company, don't worry about your thermal agenda. We can provide heat as a service. We will do that at a predictable cost. We will do that, even absorbing all the operational risks related to these new technologies. And we will also do it in a way that basically the investment is borne by that third party. And on that front, I've seen actually today very little happening. And I think there are a lot of constraints in the way to fully embrace such a model. It's often cultural. It's the fact that in the past energy sourcing has been dealt with really as a commodity type of purchase, so very transactional, arm's length relationships, very local as well, and that really needs to take a fundamental shift. We need to bring that much more to a corporate and strategic level. I really start to explore meaningful partnerships with, for instance, energy providers and the like, to basically take a fundamental strategic sourcing decision and perhaps decide that it's not part of your core competencies to start building that clean energy infrastructure.
So for companies then who need to sort of make some fairly urgent first steps. I mean, one of the things we talk about a lot on this podcast is that less than 10 years, 8 years really to 2030, and really not a long time, and it's even the 2050 deadline when you look at it through the lens of heavy industry and their investment cycles. What, if we look at these as urgent first steps, what would you say would be, for most companies, the kind of the urgent first steps that you'd be recommending they look at or consider right now?
No. Well, I think there are a couple of ways that companies can adapt their way of working. I think, first of all, it's obviously an important leadership question. Actually, we've done fairly recent a significant survey among the C-suite of companies of 1 billion in revenue and bigger across multiple sectors to understand where they stand in their emission reduction journey, and related, to indeed how they organize from a leadership perspective, from a governance perspective, strategy, et cetera, et cetera. And what was very striking is that, and it might sound silly and very evident, but it's in companies that really on the C-level created either a clear chief sustainability officer role, or that tasked not the CEO, but for instance, the COO with the emission reduction agenda and the broader sustainability agenda. It was those companies that basically were showing most success. And that's simply because these companies were effective in setting an agenda, in getting mandated by the CEO to basically create impact throughout the company, to challenge paradigms, well-established paradigms, to basically also establish that vision throughout the company, to drive that almost activism, if you want, drive that engagement within the company. And so I would say, like, it really all starts with leadership and embracing the ambiguity of venturing on that emission reduction journey. The second key thing I see is really more related to governance, and we touched upon it. I think it's critical to establish these cross-functional committees, so that you can really break down the individual stakeholder silos, that you can also partly mitigate what we see in a lot of companies, which is a very decentral way of decision making. So no power being with sites, even competition between sites that do not necessarily help to ensure that the whole footprint is moving forward. So I think it's critical that companies are sensitive to where they have these barriers, and the way that they take decisions, and the way that they bring stakeholders together, and really establish a very effective program infrastructure around their emission reduction agenda, and that's really reverberate in the whole organization. And again, get that mandate from the CEO and the board to drive results. So that's for governance. And I think a last important piece as well is culture, but that I think that goes along with the engagement. But it's striking to see, in how many companies I see that basically their cultural traits that really made them so successful today start to stand in their way. And I take, for instance, I'm not going to name specific companies, but take, for instance, in the chemical sector, where obviously you're in an environment that's very much driven by excellence, by safety, by operational excellence, safety. There you see that actually, but that inward focus that they typically have is not helping to embrace these new type of partnerships. And that has direct manifestation in the degree that they, for instance, allow collaboration with new ventures, the way that they think about sourcing future capabilities, allowing third parties on their side to implement new technologies. That's a very real barrier and constraint that these companies face, and that's entirely driven by their culture. For instance, I also take the way they do innovation. It will typically go through a lengthy R&D vetting process and by a central innovation team before technology will even hit a certain site. So all of that is really leading to long adaptation cycles of new technologies, and it's simply too slow for the speed that we need to achieve to hit our targets.
Okay, well, let's kind of draw this to a close. I mean, you started this by outlining those kind of three main areas that you think companies need to focus on. So that's the ability to see an integrated solution rather than individual tools that you're going to apply, that ability to view investment from a total cost of ownership perspective, and then of course value chain collaboration. If you are only going to focus on one, what's the most important of those right now, do you think? If you were really going to say, okay, if three's too many, here's the one you've got to look at with serious intent, what would you say is the strongest lever?
I would probably look at the way that companies take these investment decisions. The funding essentially is available. We're just missing that ability to connect the dots and to really get out of the existing capital allocation methods. I think there really lies today a very important key to accelerating the efforts. And once you start doing that, I think much of the other things we discussed about will follow. Because then you start to think about integrated scenarios. You start to look at how other companies could share some of that capex burden that you're facing, and you really start to get a much more long-term understanding of where, as a company, you will be hitting your limits, both in terms of resources and capabilities. So, that scenario thinking with total cost of ownership for me is really a key one to unlock, I think, further efforts and get more done before the end of this decade.
Well, Ben, thank you again for coming and talking to us, and hopefully we'll catch up again in the future and hear more about kind of big projects, big system changes coming online. But thank you for today.
It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you.